I would like to introduce our first speaker for today. Elena Ionescu is the Director of Sustainability for the Specialty Coffee Association of America, who is a colleague of mine and a friend. Will we say friend? Maybe a friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena Ionescu.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all for being here. So, those of you that follow me on Twitter, if any of you do, might have noticed that about a week ago I tweeted about how I was uncommonly excited about coming to this event. And I attributed part of that to wanting to come to Barcelona, where I've wanted to come for about 25 years now. So that's part of it. But I was also really excited about the prospect of speaking to baristas. And that's not just because I started my career as a barista, which I feel like at events like this, I'm like obligated to say that, I want some sort of credit from you guys, like I was a barista too. But it's also because, I talk to a lot of different groups of people representing a lot of different stages in the coffee supply chain, and not all of these groups are as receptive to messages of sustainability as baristas are. And I think that's interesting. And I wonder sometimes why that is. Why it is that, baristas are as curious as you are. And that's been the case, since I started working in specialty coffee about a dozen years ago. Now, baristas have distinguished themselves for being curious about all of the steps in the supply chain and how people work together, what their roles are, how we are all connected. And baristas have also been willing to, and we're often excited about leveraging the relationships you have with customers to try to affect positive change in the lives of coffee farmers. People who are thousands of miles away, people whom you have never met. And that's amazing. It shows, to me, an impressive degree of empathy with, again, people that you've never met before, people with whom you have coffee in common, but potentially not much else. That's something that I really admire about baristas and is different from roasters and accountants and delivery drivers. And that's not a criticism of those groups, but it's different. It's a different thing about baristas. And I wonder, why? Why is it that you do this? Why do we do this? And if you've been in coffee for any length of time, you've probably heard some of our industry's favorite stories. And one of our favorite stories, I think, is how coffee houses over the course of centuries across cultures have been places where people come together and they engage in intellectual discourse. Sometimes they plan revolutions. I love these stories, and I think they're powerful. But I wonder, if I can do a quick poll, how many of you, when you go to work, feel like you're going to start a revolution at your coffee shop? Anyone? No revolutionaries in the audience. I don't blame you. Most of the time when we're talking about the role of the barista, we're talking about service, and we're talking about, food service. Those words are often put together because we are serving the needs of our customers. And our customers may approach us with all sorts of different requests and in all sorts of different, states of being. And our job is to respond to them with empathy, is to be able to connect to them where they are. And if we care about sustainability, we recognize that our customers are not dragging themselves out of bed and to our shops in the morning because they want to know the latest news on how smallholder farmers in Kenya are adapting to climate change. No, that's not why they're there. But yet, we know that it's important. We feel connected to those smallholder farmers. We represent those smallholder farmers. So we persist in trying to deliver that information anyway, because we know that it's important, and because we are in the middle of this chain, and we are empathizing, not just with those smallholder farmers in the situation that they're in, that we're imagining, but we're also empathizing with our customers and balancing that. It's an enormous amount of work. And it's different, again, than many other roles in the supply chain. I imagine that many of you feel like you spend most of your time listening. And this is interesting to me. This is background for the topic that I wanted to talk about today, because I feel like I've spent a good amount of time thinking about listening this past year and a half. I joined the SCAA as their Director of Sustainability in June of 2015. And in the past 18 months, I've probably spent more time thinking about and certainly speaking about farm workers in coffee than I expected to, and more time than I've spent thinking or talking about any other issue. And this was surprising to me. You know, I didn't mention farm workers once during the extensive interview process that I had for this job. I talked about climate change, I talked about the volatility of the commodity futures market, but farm workers were not on my radar, despite spending many years traveling to coffee farms, working with farmers and seeing coffee farm workers. I never really spoke to them, and I didn't think about them very often. And I wasn't the only one. You know, this was reflective of the state of the community. And yet, here I am 18 months later talking about farm workers, doing the third talk that I've done this year about issues related to farm labor. So, okay, what changed? I'm sure you're wondering what happened to completely reverse my, and raise my awareness of this group. And it was due to a few different factors. One of these was the threat of publication of a consumer watch report on coffee by a group in Denmark called Danwatch. This is the cover of a report issued in March of this year called Bitter Coffee that was about slave-like working conditions on Brazilian coffee farms. And it's been something that our community has been aware of for the past, I would say, year and a half, more or less, maybe going on 2 years. The idea that there are groups out there who are becoming aware of the sometimes illegal, sometimes just less than ideal conditions under which people are employed in coffee farming around the world. So this is not a problem that's unique to Brazil, or even necessarily worse in Brazil, but this is the first of these reports that's come out, and it hasn't been the last one. There have been others as well. So reports like these threaten to expose individual companies and also the brand of specialty coffee to accusations of slave-like working conditions and child labor. So that was one thing that changed. Another thing is the recognition that our industry and our segment of the industry has really experienced enormous growth over the past decade. And the fastest growing segment of this specialty industry is the growth of certified coffees. So this graph here is just one that I took for a specific set of years within this past decade, 2006 through 2009. And you can see how for all of these certifications, they're all growing. The recognition of, the role of certifications and in sustainability has increased greatly among consumers. And so that was the second factor that influenced this recognition, because many consumers, whether or not it's justified, expect that coffees that are certified will be immune to the kind of accusations that the Danwatch report brings up, accusations of, child labor, accusations of slavery, that these certifications should cover us on that. And third is changing conditions on the ground for coffee farmers and coffee workers alike. Over the past few years, farmers who have previously been more interested in talking about, or had previously been more interested in talking about challenges related to quality or related to, again, climate change or the volatility of the coffee market, these issues that were more on my radar have been speaking about the need to address labor shortage. And that labor shortage has been exacerbated by a number of factors. One of them is, of course, the constant volatility, low market prices. But other factors include the devastating outbreaks of coffee leaf rust in Colombia in 2009, in Central America in 2013. So these leaf rust outbreaks led to labor migration, massive migration, which means that it's difficult for farmers to find enough labor during the harvest season. And then because rust decreases the output of coffee trees, it's difficult for workers to pick enough coffee to make money. So you have this sort of duality of factors, pressure coming from both sides. And I think there's an analogy to be made between labor and rust. And as much as coffee leaf rust is not a new disease, it has been around literally for centuries. But under certain conditions, exacerbated by economic factors, and then also by climatic factors, it will go from being a low-level disease to something that breaks out and can devastate an entire region, producing region or a country or the Central America altogether. Labor is the same way. Given coffee's colonial history, I think it's pretty safe to say that there have been issues around farm labor, underpayment, non-payment, for as long as coffee has been planted on a commercial scale. This is not a new issue. These are not new issues at all. But we don't see them. They're exacerbated by changes in the economy, by changes in climate, by changes in the social realm as well. And as I said before, these are also not limited to a particular group. There's pressure being exerted from both sides. So this picture comes from a recent protest in Guatemala, at which farm workers were protesting the low wages being paid. And at the same time, farmers who were responsible for paying workers were protesting the high taxes that they are incurring from the government that's making it even more difficult to pay sufficient wages to keep their workers. So in some ways, this is not a simple issue. There's no simple fix here where farmers just need to pay higher prices, or we just need to fix the market price and that'll somehow trickle down to everyone. It's a really complicated intersection that affects everyone. So, just to review. We've got an issue here. We've got issues surrounding farm workers. And these are issues that are not bound by geography. And these are issues that have existed for as long as coffee has been planted. And yet, we haven't been talking about them. And even more than that, we have not been talking to the people who were at the center of all of these issues. So as all of this became clear to me over the course of this, entering this new job of mine and seeing myself faced with all of this, this complexity, one of the things I realized was that we need to talk to farm workers. We need to have a better sense of what is actually going on in the words of the people who are experiencing these issues. And there has been remarkably little done on that. So the SCAA got together with an organization called Solidaridad and commissioned a report a study that interviewed farmers and farm workers in Colombia and Nicaragua about their experiences on small farms, on large farms, to better understand the context for the issues that we were hearing about. And there were some things in this report that were surprising and some things that were unsurprising. Around the same time, the Colombian Coffee Federation, or FNC, commissioned a study of its own of the labor context in Colombia and on Colombia's coffee farms. And preliminary results from both of these studies were shared at the SCAA Expo in Atlanta in April of 2016. And again, the questions that were asked, some of them revealed results that were unsurprising. For example, if any of you have talked to farmers over the course of, say, the past decade, you've probably heard that labor comprises a huge percentage of most farmers' costs of production. Coffee is very labor intensive to harvest by hand. So, up to 70% of a farm's cost of production per kilo of coffee can be attributed to the cost of the labor to, do the picking, to do the weeding and the pruning. It's very labor intensive, and this is not a surprise. However, having evidence to back up that anecdotal experience is a helpful thing. It's difficult to make a case just based on a single farmer's reports of their experiences. So having more data is a good thing, even if we think we already know. There are other results that were very surprising. I presented on labor at RICO in Dublin a few months ago, and I shared this same graph. And something that's so interesting about this graph to me that comes from the Colombian Coffee Federation's study is that food was ranked as high as it was here as a priority. It's ranked above the coffee plot conditions, and coffee plot conditions typically translate to how much coffee a picker is going to be able to harvest in a day, which is directly correlated to their income. So in this particular situation, food is number one. It's the thing that the most people ranked as important to them. And many coffee pickers are seasonal laborers. Many people are coming from far away. They're not, they might be staying on the farm, or they might be picking a farm that's near their home, but they're making these decisions on an annual basis about where to pick coffee. They could go to one farm, or they could go to a farm next door, or they could travel far for good coffee plot conditions and for good food. These are things that a farm worker is weighing on an annual basis. So that was a really surprising finding to me. Another finding that sticks with me from that Solidaridad study is that when surveying farm workers in both Colombia and Nicaragua, one of the priorities that comes up is good cell phone service. Farm workers want to be on farms that are close to metropolitan areas for the ease of transportation and for good cell phone service. And on the one hand, that's totally intuitive, because I'm sure that some of you have looked at your phone since I started talking. I'm always looking for cell phone service. But on the other hand, it is surprising because we never talk about that. I've never heard a farmer say that one of the things that they're going to do in order to try to retain workers is to increase their cell phone coverage. It's not a tool that we have in our toolbox right now. So all of this is an argument in favor of asking more questions. Asking questions and listening to the answers that we get, because some of them are surprising, but some of them are not surprising, but some of them are. And the scale of the study done between SCAA and Solidaridad in Colombia and Nicaragua is so small that there's no way we can extrapolate the results to the national level, much less to the global level when it comes to how we should approach these problems. You can see from these charts, which come from that study, that there are some conditions in common, some things like migration of workers that you may experience in both of these places. But then there are some conditions that are unique, and even such a small study, the answers, the solutions are not going to be the same in every place, despite the commonality of these issues. So we need to ask more questions. And this brings me back to where I started, which is the passion and curiosity of baristas. I talked about empathy and being a good listener, and I feel like I have learned lessons about the importance of listening through the work that we've done with farm workers this past year. And I'm wary of making too many analogies between the work of baristas and the work of coffee farm workers, because these groups are different and they have different challenges. But I think that there are some important parallels too. These are also groups that are comparatively large. There are a lot more people working as baristas than working as coffee roasters, for example. And there are also analogies to be made about the comparative influence and how to wield that influence. Now, baristas have a tool in the Barista Guild, which most coffee farm workers don't have any kind of guild-like representation. But these groups also exist because of the work and the volunteerism of individuals and that sort of desire to work on behalf of the interests of a group. And although I don't work as a barista anymore, I still feel like I am one of those people who wants to make the role of the barista sustainable, who really cares about this and knows that there are factors that need to change in order for that to be true. I know that those factors are also different for every individual, but that there may be some commonality. There may be some things that we have in common and some knowledge that baristas in this room have that would be useful to all of those, like me, like others, who do want to work on behalf of baristas and want the barista role to be sustainable into the future. So I'd like to use the time that we have here in the workshop, this afternoon in particular, to ask questions and to listen to the answers about what it is that baristas value. What are those things that we may not know and that we think we do? Because this is a different generation, in the same way that coffee farmers 10 years ago did not all have cell phones, much less coffee farm workers. Now pretty much everyone does, and cell phone service is a priority. So what are the things that we don't know? What are the questions that we should be asking? And what are the answers that we might be able to share with the coffee community at large? So I hope to ask you some questions. I hope that you'll trust that I'm listening to your answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. That was great.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have lots of questions, but I also get to work with you, and I can ask these questions all the time. So I wanted to ask the group if anyone has questions straight away. If they don't, I do have questions, but Isa has a mic, so if you raise your hand, we can get a microphone to you. No one? Oh, hey, right here. Great.
I would like to know, did you ask also about sanitary service?
You know, I don't think that there was a specific question in the SCAA study, in the Solidaridad study, about sanitary service, like, or do you mean about the sort of relative importance of sanitary service?
Yes, like for example, just having the basic necessity for one toilet, bathroom, all those kind of things. Health service.
I'd have to check, because there are specific farms I've visited that have addressed that in various ways, or talked about their experiences with how, where that falls on the priority list. But I don't know on kind of a broader level how that was approached.
So Dan watched produce another report about Guatemala, and I was a bit confused because at first I thought, oh, this is horrible because it's the same as Brazil. And then I forgot the name of the organization, but the coffee organization from Guatemala said, hey man, this is just how we work, and it's really fine, and it's, we're trying really hard, but I was a bit confused because there were two different opinions.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I think these watch reports are pretty scathing on finding conditions that, again, are not limited to Brazil or Guatemala, as far as children working in the fields with their parents. And there's so much complexity around it. There are these cultural aspects which the Guatemalan Coffee Association noted, that this is traditional, this is how it's always been done, it keeps families together. And I can sympathize with that argument. On the other hand, I also know that there are international labor organization standards for a reason, and that having coffee, or that approaching each case as somehow, it's difficult to know how many factors to consider. And another argument that Anacafe, this Guatemalan association, made, which was legitimate, is the prices are so low and we keep raising the minimum wage. How are we supposed to do everything? How are we supposed to, at the national level, enforce minimum wage and also comply with these, or sell into this international market? There's just not enough money to go around, which is, again, not to say that it's all the responsibility of the company to make sure that these abuses aren't occurring in their supply chains. Like the government and Ministry of Labor does play a role in enforcing minimum wage. But on the other hand, if we know that those departments are underfunded, then can we as companies just say, well, it's not my job. Like, you make sure that you pay minimum wage, and we'll just do what we've always done. It's a complicated issue.
Sorry. Right here, Isa.
Kim, that was really insightful. I'm a coffee roaster. I'm from Ireland, and I'm relatively new to the coffee industry, and specifically specialty. So I see it as a responsibility for me as a roaster to learn more about what's happening on farms. I haven't visited any yet, but I'm really interested in the report from Solidaridad and what SCAA's vision is long term for what's going to come out of that. What actions will the organization take? And I suppose for those of us who are baristas or roasters, one of the things I've taken from that is I need to start asking more questions. What kind of questions should we be asking? And with that information, that's really powerful. So I can put a bit more pressure on the wholesaler. But thank you, it was really good.
Yeah, thank you. So I have two things that occur to me as you say that. One of them is when it comes to what the SCAA can do, in some ways, before I joined the SCAA, I was a coffee buyer, and it was easy comparatively to test ideas because I could just build it into the price of coffee. I would say, oh, let's add 10 cents for this or 10 cents for that, and see what happens. I'll build myself a little project fund and then I'll use it. And now, the SCAA doesn't buy any coffee, so I feel a little bit like, wow, I'm learning all of these things that I didn't know, and yet I have no way to test this. I don't get to go out and just say, oh, I'm going to build in a 10-cent premium to go to farm workers, or to host a workshop between farm owners and farm workers to, begin a dialogue. Because again, I'm not going to fix this as an outsider anyway. So it's tricky. It feels like, all right, I have now a lot of a big platform, but not a lot of direct influence. However, another thing I hear you asking for is that, or interested in, is this idea of like what questions to ask. And I think that that is an area where coming out of a report like this, or out of the, at some point, you know, we have enough information that we can start to say, here are 5 questions that you can ask. And it's not, again, it's not going to fix things. It's not going to, that's not the extent of your responsibility as an individual. But I have a sense that, you know, if there are, like, if you're concerned, or even if you're not concerned, but if you're going to ask about 5 things, these are the 5 things to ask about. Are workers housed on site? And if so, can I see the lodgings? Do you keep records of how much people were paid? Like, those sorts of basic things that if the answer is no, can at least give you a sense that I think there may be something here that I need to address immediately. And if the answers are all yes, then it's okay, we've got a good foundation. How can we continue to improve?
I have just on that note, you know, when you and I were talking about this talk and what we would talk about, and the question over not pretending to know what baristas actually want and all, and that kind of correlation you drew. And I remember when I was learning at first about coffee, that kind of overwhelming sense of like, I know nothing about origin, I know nothing about agronomy or about those conditions, and the desire to learn more. But it is, when you talk about asking questions and generating awareness, do you think there's sort of like, what's enough? Like what is a certain amount that we would hope baristas to be aware of that we feel is we feel good about them knowing that? Is there a goal in mind what to then do with that information? Because as you said, like at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday raining morning, nobody wants to hear about this stuff. So what do we hope baristas do with this information? How much would you want them to know, if you could put a number on that or a quantity?
78? No, that's not specialty. 87? You know, okay, so I'm idealistic, and I also am coming from a background in which I was a barista and became curious, and that has served me very well. On the other hand, I also see the potential to be frustrated when you are in the position of like being the last link in the chain, the one who faces consumers, that everyone else can put a lot on you, like you have to talk about this and don't forget to tell them about this, and then there's this, and but also people, nobody cares about any of that, or nobody's ever asking me that, and how am I supposed to represent all of these people all of the time, and to do it at minimum wage, and to try to be thinking about getting a tip for the work that I'm doing, which is probably not gonna happen if I lecture them on climate change. Like, how do I do these things? How do I balance all of this? It feels like you're asking for a lot, you know, and I'm not getting a lot in return. So I want to encourage it to the point that it feels like, it feels powerful to be part of this chain and to have this role, because that's how I have approached coffee, and it feels like that's the potential, the enormous potential of coffee and all of these connections. But stop short of the point where it feels like, you know, because as I said, I think this role requires a lot of empathy, and there's that idea of pride and representation, but representing all of these things and then not getting the kind of respect or the remuneration that would accompany such a role if it is indeed so valuable.
More questions? Right over here. Isa. Here, I'll put my mic.
Thank you very much for today. This is incredibly informative. I just had a question about, in terms of general representation of farmers, in terms of the SCAA's involvement and interest at present, is this the first time that we've seen these questions being asked to farmers? You know, drawing a parallel between the barista community representation and events like this, is there a parallel to be drawn? Is there any voice presently for farmers, or is this the first time?
You know, this is the first time, I believe, that any of these questions have been asked of farm workers. You know, we have, over the past decade, and beyond, and before that also, but over the past decade, you know, we've become a lot more aware of and supportive, I would say, not to the extent that we need to be, but a lot more supportive and inclusive of farmers, especially farmers who are English speaking and farmers who have the means to bring themselves to events in coffee consuming countries, you know, like these annual conferences. Those farmers have their voices have been amplified enormously, but they don't speak for all farmers. There is an element of tokenism in the way that farmers have been approached, and there's a producers guild forming now within the SCAA that I'm really excited about, because it feels like a big step away from that tokenism and toward representation for the needs that are generated by the producer community, as opposed to the the needs that I may see as a roaster, and then pull in my producer friend who I know also feels the same way to speak on that from a producer perspective. It's kind of how it's been approached today. And farm workers are still, if these are the first questions, then, and there are more people working as farm workers than probably at any other stage in the supply chain. We've got like the biggest group that we've asked the fewest questions of, and there's zero representation. And it's not just in coffee, like agricultural work in general. It's really difficult to talk to farm workers or to have farm workers represented. So I think that we're probably still a ways off from that point. But we are doing that, and again, I think that the baristas also over the past 10 years have really identified with and sort of carried the banner for farmers. But in some ways also, I wonder whether there's a closer analogy between baristas and farm workers as far as how much power you have, how much influence to change the shop in which you work. If you're a barista and an owner of a shop, then maybe you're more like a small farmer. But if you're a barista at someone else's shop, then you may actually, in some ways, have more in common with the influence of a farm worker over a farm than with the farmer, him or herself.
I have a question here.
Hi. I don't want to take away from your focus on farm workers, but I have a more general question about sustainability. In the blueprint against hunger in the coffee lands, there's a big part that says about diversity of crops and how do we as an industry, how can we support that? It's something that I've seen quite a lot, that coffee farmers have a lot of coffee and not a lot of diverse crops, and that they get into the hunger months without actually producing any food anymore.
This is my secret favorite topic right now, is diversification, because I'm aware of the fact that, or I'm increasingly aware of the fact, again, one of these like eye-opening things that comes with time and experience and perspective, that we as coffee people tend to see the whole world through the coffee lens. So, and it's reflected even in the language that we use. We talk about coffee producers as though that's their function in the world, is to produce coffee. Coffee producing communities, as though these communities produce nothing other than coffee. And it makes sense. I mean, we are the coffee industry. Like, that is our interest. But I think that it also reflects the fact that if we think about solutions, we can only see those through coffee. Like, how do we increase productivity on a coffee farm to the point that that amount of coffee and the price they receive for it covers all of their financial needs? And for some farms, that makes sense. That's been the model specialization that most farms, most agriculture has worked on. But on the other hand, if we're talking about comparatively small farms and a seasonal agricultural product, then it may be possible that there's just not enough, there's not enough productivity on a small parcel of land that's going to bring in enough income, much less provide enough work over the course of the year to keep people employed, to keep migration from happening into the city or to another farm to do another sort of work. I think that we, although focusing on coffee makes sense for the coffee industry, that we're also missing, there are a lot of farms that are not going, we can't solve their problems through focusing on coffee alone. And how do we work with other industries, or how do we figure out what coffee's role is in a diversified farming structure, or that kind of plan? Like, who else needs to be involved? How do we work with, we all took the tour of the chocolate factory, and we know that many farmers grow cocoa and coffee on the same farm. Is it possible to make those connected, to be more collaborative across these industries, or with the, natural care products industry, or is this just, again, kind of casting around for for what seems possible.
So should this be the responsibility? Because right now NGOs are doing this a lot by like planting trees and educating farmers about diversification and nutrition of the soil. But should that also be like in the budget of a roaster?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of gets to this. I was talking to Francis a minute ago about the commons. Whose interest is this really, and to what degree are we all invested? Because we have businesses that are based on coffee, and when it comes to farm workers, like you would think they'd be the most important people, because literally nothing else happens if the coffee doesn't get picked. So. To what degree is it in our interest, and do we have that responsibility? But beyond responsibility, just like that basic business interest in doing it. With so many of these issues, it feels fuzzy. Like there's an interest that is the farmers, and there's an interest that's the governments, and there's an interest that's the businesses, and then there's an interest that's the NGOs. How do we suss out kind of who is responsible for what, or how we can share that so that businesses don't just depend on NGOs to, say, like, provide, or governments don't depend on NGOs to build schools, when really, like, is that the ideal entity to be covering education in a country? Probably not. And businesses don't depend on farmers to want to farm coffee without making economic sense, just because they have done that in the past. How do we do that? Or who does research? Those are really interesting questions. So, of course, business, there is a role there, and I don't know what it is, but the clock is ticking. Yes, the scarf.
We're talking about specialty coffee, especially now.
I'm sorry.
Okay. We're talking here about specialty coffee, and that's only 1% of the total coffee production. What could be the role of the SCAA and the SCAE in the total coffee industry as a motivator to make more sustainable coffee for the whole coffee industry?
The role of the SCAA and specialty and sustainability is an interesting one, because it is, like, we have smaller market share, but on the other hand, we have a very vocal and very visible community. Starbucks is always the brand that is most reviled and also most important, in as much as it has this, it's so much seen by consumers. So, and that's just the biggest one. But specialty brands, I think, punch above their weight class when it comes to what their sort of programs, their ideas, their movement in the direction of sustainability being adopted by, or at least paid attention to, by larger companies. So in many cases, when it comes to real sustainability, having standards and having things that can be measured and benchmarked against and moved, the commercial coffee sector is actually way ahead of us. I think there are a lot of specialty companies that believe very strongly in something, but don't have any data to back it up, don't track anything, that don't necessarily have a multi-year contract with a coffee producer. So it's very, it's inspirational and idealistic, but not grounded in, it's not grounded. But on the other hand, some of the bigger sustainability standards are pretty unambitious, So how, I think, do we balance these two things? How do we use or acknowledge the fact that in order for something to be real and scalable, we have to have something that we can measure, even if it's a compromise on our ideals, but at the same time not compromise our ideals so much that we're calling something sustainable that's really only slightly above, the worst.
What was that report, the McDonald's announcement? You and I were talking about it. The moving to sustainable coffee by 20.
Oh yeah, that McDonald's has made sustainability commitments for their coffee that that if you actually read into them are like beyond what many specialty coffee companies have committed to. So, and some of that being the commitment, like you're saying that by this date we're going to do this thing, and not, we believe in these principles and we do our best to act on that when it's possible. There's a lot of really fuzzy language in we believe in this and we do our best when we can, that I get, again, I come from a small business background. Like I know that it's hard to sell these ideas to your customers or to your CEO, but I also know that that when it's not codified, it becomes very easy to make compromises. And so I think that commitments do mean a lot.
One last question.
Hi. I don't know if I missed it during your presentation, but do you know which country has the lowest minimum wage according to the study? And if you have like maybe, I don't know, a report or a scale according to farm level positions, which position earns less than the rest? Or if I can get it somewhere or any source or whatever. I think maybe pickers, because maybe you have a scales for wages for pickers according to countries, because according to what I know, what it is, they are paid by lata, by team, you know, what they pick according to the season. Thank you.
That is probably, to answer the second part of your question first, you know, pickers tend to get paid the least or potentially the least because they are the only people in the supply chain whose work is volume-based and not hourly. There are countries and there are farms that pay hourly wages, but most places around the world, pickers are paid by the volume or the weight that they pick. So, you know, it is possible as a picker to make a lot if you're on a farm that's very productive and if you're fast. And maybe if the quality standards are low and so you can, like, you don't have to pick only the ripest coffee. There are ways to, you know, hypothetically make more. But if the productivity is low because the coffee has been stricken by leaf rust, for example, or if you are female and cannot, you know, carry as much weight or pick coffee as fast, or, you know, if you're a child who's contributing to the overall, you know, like income of your family, then there's also, you know, you're making a lot less than you would be if you were paid by the hour. Most other positions in the coffee supply chain, you know, imagine like a roaster being paid based on how much coffee they were able to roast in a day as opposed to how many hours they worked. So it's that I would say the pickers are the lowest and the most unstable wages also, which is part of it. You know, instability is a huge contributor to a lot of these issues. You know, we tend to see like, oh, they don't make enough money, which is true. But then there's also the fact that, you know, the coffee harvest only lasts 3 months maximum on a given farm. So what is someone supposed to do the rest of the time? Like, do they move on to other agriculture? Do they go try to drive a taxi in a city? Like, what do you do with the other 9 months of your year? That is at least as big a problem as the wages, is the fact that it's only really, you know, time bound. And then the second part about who pays the lowest wages, I think it kind of depends on the, it depends on the farm, honestly. There are places where, like in Latin America, Mexico's minimum wage is significantly lower than Guatemala's. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, you know, Mexican farmers are paying lower wages always than Guatemalan farmers. I've seen a chart about who has the comparative highest in Latin America, government minimum wages, but the enforcement is another tricky thing. And that doesn't even take into account Africa, and it doesn't take into account Asia or, you know, sort of a comparatively, countries like Myanmar, you know, that are kind of coming out of a long period of economic disaster, and where coffee represents a huge opportunity, but labor is really cheap, versus El Salvador, where labor is really expensive. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Kim. There's two things I keep thinking about when you're saying this it's just funny how diversity is like the thing people talk about at so many levels in coffee these days. Like at a retail level, everyone's saying, diversify your product line, make it more interesting, and you're saying at an origin level, a farm level, diversity is part of the, potentially part of the solution as well. I want to just close with the thought that, again, something you and I talk about is, you don't just want to be talking heads, you don't want to do research for research's sake and have these conversations going, isn't that interesting, cool, and now back to normal. So I definitely want to encourage all of you to kind of think about this a bit more, and you'll have time in your groups later on with Kim to ask more and get into some discussions. And I think that's clearly from your responses something you're all interested in. So thank you very, very much, Kim. Elena Ionescu, everybody.